of the cases, if you will. And so when it comes to the details, I will get the information from the Heritage Minister.
Let's call violence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to try. The canvassing of issues this evening has been extraordinary, and I'm afraid all too often superficial. I want to dive into a couple of things and just ask the Minister for his reflections, because this is tough stuff. I don't think there's a single Canadian who isn't grieved whenever somebody, quote unquote, out on bail commits a crime and some innocent person, their whole life is ruined. They've lost a relative. They'll never get over it. The family that was involved in the high-speed crash on Highway 401 is a heartbreaking example. But when you look at it, and the conversation earlier tonight, saying, well, the man responsible for this was out on bail. Well, when you examine it, the individual who died in the crash and who was clearly had violated a number of laws or was accused of violating laws, was under bail conditions not to be behind the wheel of a vehicle, should not have been chased. It's complicated. Who's responsible for a high-speed crash going the wrong way down the 401 that kills grandparents and an infant? It's all too simple to say it's the person who was under bail conditions not to drive, but the high-speed chase that ensued was, from everything I've seen, against all police protocols. The person who had committed the crime had committed a crime of a liquor store theft. He wasn't thought to be at risk of violently offending or about to kill or abduct or kidnap someone. So the high-speed chase was seen to be, by many law enforcement officials, the wrong reaction at the wrong moment that led to tragedy. Does the Minister have any thoughts on that particular example?
The Honourable Minister of Justice has 1 minute and a few seconds to answer.
Member opposite from Saanich Gulf Islands for a contribution is that bail decisions are made by individual justices of the peace or provincial court judges around the country all of the time. And they're always trying to work according to those three principles that I mentioned about flight risks, about likelihood of reoffending, and about sending a message to the community and ensuring confidence in the administration of justice. With respect to police actions, I think that bears some inquiry in terms of sort of why a police pursuit was taking place in the wrong direction on the highway in that instance. But what I would share with her is the incredible sadness and sympathy that I feel for that family that suffered such a horrific loss. And what we're working constantly is to ensure less fatal accidents of that nature and ensure that we're keeping Canadians as safe as possible at all times.
The Honourable Member from Saanich Gulf Islands.
Yeah, another specific case, and this really goes to the heart. I think all these specific examples that are exploited end up leading people to doubt some fundamentals of our British common law criminal justice system, which is you're innocent until proven guilty. And people out on bail are essentially legally innocent people. They have not been found guilty of crimes. We take the example recently of Umar Zamir, who was involved in a tragic accident in which a police officer was killed in July of 2021. The prosecution and the justice system decided to charge him with first-degree murder, that he knowingly knew this was a policeman and deliberately killed him. He wasn't released. He wasn't found not guilty until nearly 3 years later, and the court, in an extraordinary measure, the judge apologized to Mr. Zamir. His lawyer, Mr. Nader Hassan, reports that he was also harassed and received hate mail for the horror that he would represent someone who was charged with first-degree murder. Again, this was someone who nearly had his liberties taken from him forever in what was a very harsh prosecution. But at the essence of the response immediately when he was released on bail from public figures whom I respect, like former Toronto Mayor John Tory. How could this happen? This is dreadful. Does the Minister have any concerns, as I do, that if we fail to remember that we're innocent until proven guilty in our criminal law system, we're at larger peril than the individual cases that we're talking about?
The Honourable Minister of Justice has 1 minute and 35 seconds.
Umar Zamir case exemplifies is the importance of being judicious in our language and ensuring that we don't wade into decisions that govern criminal prosecutions and decisions that are being made by our courts and our justices of the peace. There's never been a more clear example, to my mind. What I would underscore is that the presumption of innocence also includes a presumption and an entitlement to not be denied reasonable bail without just cause. That's protected under Section 11E of the Charter, and its salutary impact is demonstrably exemplified in the Umar Zamir case. What I found very troubling is that a number of politicians of various stripes weighed into that matter about decrying at the first instance the abject horror of the notion of somebody like Mr. Zamir being granted bail. He was ultimately vindicated and found to have been not guilty. I think that demonstrates that the work that the system does is necessary, and it's doing the work that it needs to do in an impartial and independent manner. It goes back to some of the interventions we heard earlier from the member from Kamloops Caribou when he talked about my attendance in court during open court processes. Attempts to influence actively or even the perceptions of such influence are untoward in this country. That is inappropriate behavior that should never be countenanced, and comments on the appropriateness or not of a bail decision in a given matter are equally inappropriate and not suitable in a democracy such as ours, where we need to safeguard the lines between independent prosecutions and adjudication and political involvement.
The honourable member from Saanich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, it seems that the bail supervision programs, which are cost-effective, are quite underfunded. Am I correct that those are funded through provincial and territorial governments?
The honourable minister has 15 seconds.
The bail supervision and monitoring bail in terms of how changes land on the ground, who's getting bail and who are not, is absolutely funded by the provinces, and we've been encouraging them to track this information better so we can make any further changes that are required.
Honourable member from Saanich Gulf Islands.
I mentioned what's cost effective because currently it's about $120,000 a year per inmate to keep people in jail. And there are currently more legally innocent people awaiting trial, still legally presumed innocent until proven guilty, in the jails of our provinces and territories than there are people who've been proven guilty. Does the minister understand that to be the case?
The Honourable Minister of Justice has 24 seconds.
I absolutely understand that to be the case, and really undercuts this narrative that bail is somehow too facile to obtain in this country, when 70% of the population in our prisons around the country are actually on remand. That is exactly commensurate with other peer countries, and I think that underscores the point that the issues that need to be addressed are widespread and include how we track bail and the decisions that are being made by justices of the peace.
The honourable member from Saanich Gulf Islands.
The question that occurs to me often is, I never practiced criminal law, but members of my family have been prosecutors, and one of the things that seems outside your jurisdiction, the jurisdiction of federal government, but wouldn't it be salutary to find some way that when someone violates bail conditions or their surety isn't observing them, that bail is actually collected? Because as a general matter, people put money forward as bail money for someone to be released on bail, but when those conditions are violated, does the minister have any data as to how often the bail money is then collected from those who've put it forward?
The Honourable Minister has 37 seconds.
This is a very important suggestion. I do not have that data, but I can assure the member that at my next federal, provincial, territorial meeting, which is in Yellowknife in the fall, I will raise this very issue. We've raised issues about how we're changing the bail rules at the federal level, but how they're landing on the ground in terms of supervision of bail, and when bail is violated, whether monies are collected, is an important issue that I will raise at that meeting.
The Honourable Member from Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to turn to Bill C-63 because I think I support Bill C-63, the online hate bill, but I don't think it gets adequately to some of the questions of algorithms. I think we have a real problem with rage farming. As a matter of fact, some of these examples I've raised tonight as examples are specifically useful because they raise ire and quick reaction and can be used to change public opinion through the manufacturing of a degree of rage that might otherwise not exist if all the facts were thoroughly discussed. Does the minister believe C-63 can get at something like rage farming without getting at the algorithms?
The Honourable Minister has 40 seconds.
Well, I'd say a few responses. So first of all, Bill C-63 contemplates a responsibility to file a digital safety plan with the new commissioner to indicate how you're going to moderate risk for your users, and lastly, to be vetted against that moderation and to be subject to penalties or orders by the Digital Safety Commissioner. It also contemplates the idea that the Digital Safety Commissioner could greenlight researchers at universities around the country to get access to some of the inner workings of the platforms. This has been hailed by people like Frances Haugens, the famous Facebook whistleblower, as internationally leading legislation on promoting some of the transparency that the member opposite is seeking, which I seek as well.
The Honourable Member from Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to turn to the question of Victims' Bill of Rights, because when the Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights was going through this place, and I had the honour to be a member of Parliament at that time, I worked with then Ombudsperson Sue Sullivan, who was trying to get some specific ways of enforcing Victims' Bills of Rights. It's one thing to write the Victims' Bills of Rights, but Canada's pretty well known around the world as having rights for victims that can't be enforced. And I wonder if the minister is open to looking at the way the state of California pursues protecting victims' rights to, say, information, to emotional support, and so on, through what's in California called Marcy's Law.
The Honourable Minister has 41 seconds.
I'd be very open to looking at what's transpiring in California. I think centering victims at the heart of our criminal justice strategy is important, and I think we've been attempting to do that with respect to victims of hatred through the online hate bill, victims of child sex predation through Bill C-63, victims of intimate partner violence through our changes to the bail regime, not once but twice, through Bill C-48 and Bill C-75, and fundamentally to victims of gun violence in this country through bills like Bill C-21, which would put a freeze on handgun sales and ensure tougher penalties with respect to things like gun trafficking. These are important provisions, but I'm definitely willing to entertain suggestions about what they're doing in California and look whether models could be brought over.
The Honourable Member from Saanich Gulf Islands.
One of the things that concerns victims and their families is the sort of black box around plea bargaining. Victims' impact statements can happen at the point of open court, but plea bargaining leaves victims and families out, and I wonder if the minister has any thoughts on how Canada could get the balance right to ensure that victims and their families have more access to consideration in the plea bargaining process.
The Honourable Minister has 25 seconds.
Just reflect on the fact that when we were looking at Bill S-12, if I remember the numbering correctly, with the sex offender registry, we heard greatly from victims about the context of things like non-disclosure agreements and where their autonomy was vitiated, and we looked at how we could recalibrate that so that they could have control over their information. I think that's important, and that guides me in terms of the work that I do. What I would also underscore is that in the Victims Fund, we've injected an amount of $40 million in 2023-24 to support victim-focused measures.
The Honourable Member from Saanich Gulf Islands.
I also recall when we were debating that and other issues in this place relating to mandatory minimums, there was a fair degree of evidence and concern that as jurisdictions used mandatory minimums, it tended to decrease what a judge did at the moment of sentencing and increase the likelihood of plea bargaining, as defense lawyers realized they weren't going to have much option because there was a mandatory minimum associated. I wonder if the minister has any thoughts on whether plea bargaining is more likely in jurisdictions that have plea bargaining, where plea bargaining is more likely when you have mandatory minimum sentences over many offenses.
The Honourable Minister has 37 seconds.
So I understand the gist of the member's question, but what I would say is that what we've seen in terms of tracking the data is that when there's a mandatory minimum in place, it actually results in longer processes because plea bargaining doesn't occur as frequently, because the nature of the minimum penalty is already entrenched in law. That has resulted in more judicial resources and more delays. And in fact, Ben Perrin, who is the individual who's been involved with a great deal of mandatory minimum considerations, a former advisor to to Stephen Harper, described them as a grave policy failure and cheap politics, and said, quote unquote, Poilievre's idea may actually backfire, leading to more.
Even if the Honourable Minister could The Honourable Minister's microphone has been cut. I just want to inform the Honourable Minister and all Honourable Members that when referring to members of Parliament, even if they are quoting, they are to refer to them by their riding names or by the position that they hold and not by their names. The Honourable Minister only had about 3 seconds left on the clock, so I'm going to go back to the Honourable Member from Saanich Gulf Island, who has 1 minute and 8 seconds left for questions and answers.
In that time, the Minister will not be surprised that I want to turn to Bill C-69 and the sections related to the Impact Assessment Act. I never did practice constitutional law, but I've been consulting with some constitutional law experts. Does the Minister think that, well, he brought the bill forward, so he must think it will meet the standards of the Supreme Court of Canada, that this is federal jurisdiction? I don't. I wonder if the Minister is open to considering changes even at this stage to ensure that environmental assessment is returned to the 4 squares of federal jurisdiction, as was the case under Brian Mulroney's version of environmental assessment that was repealed by Stephen Harper.
The Honourable Minister has only 28 seconds left on the clock.
And what I would say with respect to the Impact Assessment Act is that we've looked at the Supreme Court decision from October of 2023, and I'm very confident that the proposed amendments would address the concerns identified by the Court and establish a robust and constitutional impact process. And what I would say with respect to the mandatory minimum piece is I would quote David Dobney, a former Conservative MP, who said, quote, "The proliferation of mandatory minimum sentencing will lead to fewer guilty pleas, significant processing delays, big increases in the number of accused persons awaiting trial in already overcrowded."
And the Honourable Minister has run out of time.